Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad, conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad, conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad, conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país.
translation when somebody speaks in Spanish.
Ah, okay.
So I think that I will make your presentation in Spanish. Okay. Because it's a country. It's our official language. Imperial is fine, but not that much. Not that much. Ah, es que estaba apretando otro lado. Entonces, es un gusto para nosotros, un honor, un gusto tener en la universidad a dos grandes economistas encabezados este tour por Joe Stiglitz. Está de más conocerlo. Cuando a mí me comentan de él, yo digo, mira, cuando uno hace una lista de los 20 economistas más importantes, para no ser exagerado, del siglo XX, Joe Stiglitz va a estar en todas las listas. Aprendimos muchísimo de él. A mí me tocó aprender mucho de su época peak, su paper de credit rationing, monopolistic competition, su paper con Grossman. O sea, hemos aprendido muchísimo de él. Y obviamente él tiene mucho que pensar y sigue pensando, como vamos a ver en esta presentación, así que no necesito leerle su currículum, decir que el 2001 ganó el Premio Nobel de Economía por Perfect Information y todas esas cosas que usted las debería saber bastante bien. Obviamente está acompañado por Martin Guzmán, un buen amigo economista latinoamericano. Martín estudió su pregrado y su maestría en la Universidad de La Plata, se egresó el año 2007, ahí lo voy a presentar más porque todavía no es tan conocido. Después se fue a hacer un doctorado a la Universidad de Brown y entre 2013 y 2016 un postdoctorado en Columbia, donde trabajó con Joe. Y de hecho, bueno, ahí yo también conocí a Martín una vez que andaba con Joe en una reunión de Rich Macroeconomics. Y con Joe dirige el programa de formación académica llamado Institute for Policy Dialogue de la Universidad de Columbia. Es el miembro también del grupo de investigaciones sobre inestabilidad y externalidades macroeconómicas del Institute for New Thinking. Es un think tank sin fines de lucro creado con el objetivo de aportar nuevas visiones a la economía y ha sido bastante activo. Es Senior Fellow Non-Resident del Center for International Governance and Innovation. Actualmente es profesor titular en moneda, crédito y bancos en la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de su universidad, la Universidad de La Plata, y es profesor asociado a macroeconomía de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas en la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Ha tenido una prolífica, para sus años además, actividad académica, ha publicado numerosos artículos y fue ministro de Economía en Argentina en los años 2019-2020. Así que tengo el gusto de dejarlo a ustedes con la presentación que va a hacer Joe sobre Understanding Disequilibrium Theory. Welcome, Joe. Welcome. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and what we're going to be talking about is a rethinking of macroeconomics. One way of thinking about where we are today is that economics developed, modern economics was very influenced by the development of physics in the 19th century. Equilibrium theories dominated in physics, and economics aspired to be a science like physics. And so they developed theories like equilibrium forces, and that's the metaphor that had an enormous amount of influence in the evolution of standard economic thinking. But the world we live in is not really a world of equilibrium. And if you thought it was, you haven't lived through the last 20 years, and obviously most of you that's been much of your life, has been a life of shocks. We had 9/11, we had the financial crisis in 2008, then we had another disaster, the election of President Trump. And that was a major change to how we viewed globalization. We had been working for a world without borders, and all of a sudden borders started to be erected. And then just a few years later, we had the pandemic. And in Chile, you had some disturbances in 2019, and those continue. And then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, none of those things could have been predicted. And each of those things has had major macroeconomic effects. And policymakers have to deal with those major economic effects. So in many ways, the economic theory that was attempted to emulate physics of the 19th century is not really fit for a world where there are constantly shocks that are totally unpredictable and have very major consequences. In some ways, if we were starting from scratch, the metaphor, the model that we ought to be thinking about more is evolutionary biology. That's evolution. We talk about the change in the virus, COVID-19. We know rules about how it changes. We know a lot about the mutations. We know a lot about the processes, but no one can predict exactly what the next mutation is. So there's a lot of science in evolutionary biology. There's a lot of that we know, but there's also a lot that we don't know. We can't predict some of the most important thing, whether it will evolve in ways that will be more dangerous or less dangerous, more contagious or less contagious. So in a way, what I'm going to be trying to argue, that's where we ought to be thinking in economics, that we can't, there are many things we can't predict, but there are lots of things that we still know. We know something about how the economic system works. We know something about how it responds to various kinds of shocks and various kinds of interventions. We have to admit, as I say, that our knowledge is limited, but the fact that our knowledge is limited doesn't mean that we still know a lot, and we can still intervene as a economic science and use economic science to do better economic policy. So that's the overarching framework that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to try to illustrate that by talking about the particular ways in which that equilibrium model has been misleading, almost dangerous, and the construction of an alternative model that we call disequilibrium, and how it gives us a better perspective of what to think about. Those of you who are, have been studying macroeconomic at a graduate level, know that the standard model is called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory. And the concern is not about dynamics, because any good model has to have dynamics, but they have the wrong dynamics. Stochastic just means variation, and the world we live in, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's not an objection to having stochastic, but they have the wrong stochastic model. They have a stochastic model that's based on repeated events of the same nature, whereas what we have is repeated events that are different in a fundamental way. And equilibrium is really the thing that we are concerned about, because the world is constantly thrown off kilter by events that were unpredictable. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is the word disequilibrium. Okay, so let me begin by just reiterating what I said before. The world has experienced an unprecedented set of shocks in just a short period of time. And these shocks, many of them are economic shocks, like the financial shock, but many of them are beyond economics, like the pandemic and like Trump. So they're political. But some of these are what we could say are endogenous. It wasn't something from an asteroid from outer space that hit us. We created the financial system that led to the collapse in 2008. That was something we did. And even the political events like Trump are partly endogenous. We created a divided society, a level of inequality that provided a fertile field for a demagogue. So it wasn't predictable that it would take that ugly of a form. In my book, The Price of Inequality, I said, that was written several years before the arrival of Trump, I said, this is what I'm very worried about, but what happened was far worse than I could have thought. So I'm going to focus a lot on what I call deep downturns, not the little fluctuations. If you look at GDP, it's always fluctuating a little bit. And in response to the 2008 financial crisis, there were some economists who said, we didn't predict that crisis. In fact, standard models said it couldn't happen. It was a level of irrationality beyond that which standard models with rationality could incorporate. But some economists said, well, our models are not designed to handle deep downturns. And my response is, that's like going to school, to a medical school that only trains people to deal with colds. And if you went to a doctor and he said, my specialty is colds, but if you have cancer, that's not our field. We don't deal with sick people. We only deal with people who have a little bit of sickness. Well, the things that affect people's lives the most are the deep downturns. We can weather the little fluctuations. It's the deep ones, like the Great Depression, that we need to understand. And I actually think that studying these things like deep depressions gives us a better understanding of how the economic system works. It's a little bit like in medicine, pathology is really important. Pathology, it's when the human body doesn't work normally. And by understanding what happens when it doesn't work normally, we understand what is normal. And so, to me, studying the Great Recession, the Great Depression, the response to the pandemic, these are events that have taught us an awful lot about how the system works. So the key questions are how the market economy generates such large fluctuations in aggregate demand and output that are disproportionate to any exogenous shock in the physical or technological state variables. And secondly, what are the dynamics of adjustment? Why, for instance, are they such that there are persistent levels of unemployment? It's not just unemployment goes up for a quarter and then goes down again. It took us 5-6 years to recover from the Great Recession. It took us more than 12 years to recover from the Great Depression. So any good theory has to provide us an understanding of these questions and a set of policy advice of how to respond. And one of the problems with the DSG models, the standard models, we had a financial crisis that involved the banking system, but believe it or not, and I don't want to say anything about central banks in front of, well, but I will, that many of the central bankers, I won't say what, had models of central banks without banks. And if you didn't have banks, you wouldn't have central banks. But they didn't have good models of banks. And when you had a banking crisis, they didn't have a good theory of the best way of dealing with that banking crisis. For instance, the best way of recapitalizing the banks that had gone bankrupt. Best in either efficiency, public finances, or equity. And certainly in the United States, what they did was very bad. It cost us a lot. It caused a lot of political trouble. It was very unfair, and has had long-term political consequences that we are still feeling. So let me situate this a little bit in a historical context. And when I mean a historical context, I mean a context in the development of economic theory. And the standard model in economic theory that was so dominant for a very long time was called the competitive equilibrium theory, Arrow-Debreu, which assumed perfect competition, perfect information, perfect rationality, lots of things like that, and a complete set of risk markets for all dates and all states of nature. And what that standard model implied was that there was nothing that was unanticipated. So everything that happened was a possibility. So when they were thinking about it, not only did they contemplate the possibility of Trump getting elected and the pandemic, they had markets where you could trade bets on what would, you could say, if that happens, I will pay you this much, and if it doesn't happen, you will pay me this much. So you had securities that paid off in every event. Now, of course, and the point is that these markets existed at time zero. So you imagine, how could people imagine, how could you have securities on a nuclear disaster before people thought about nuclear energy? So the model is inherently, in a world of innovation and change, incoherent. But it has been an enormously influential model. So that model, there are no shocks. And among the implications of that, there are no defaults, no bankruptcies, and no events that Martin and I refer to as macroeconomic inconsistencies. With a full set of markets, everybody writes down their plans. I will do this in this date, when this date happens, and I'll do that in that date. If that happens, they write out plans, and there are markets for each of these dates and each of these states, and all those markets clear. There are no surprises. It's just something that you anticipated as a possibility turns out to be a reality. So you're not surprised. One of those states of world was going to occur, and you see what one did occur. Is that clear? So that means in turn that everybody's life is very boring. At time zero, way back, at the time you were born, everything is laid out, and then you just watch things happen. And as I say, it's not very interesting. Now, if you haven't followed exactly what I've said, that's okay, because it's so bad economics that it just shows you haven't wasted your time learning the wrong model. But it is the dominant model in economics, or it was for a long time. And then the problem occurred, what happens if there doesn't exist these complete set of markets, a complete set of risk markets? And in particular, the most interesting thing was what happens in the context of macroeconomics, how the whole system operates. Well, the main part of the macroeconomic profession solved, and I put in quotation marks, solved the problem of the absence of risk markets by working with a model, a pretend economy, a simple economy, and you always have to simplify. The question is, are they the right simplifications? They worked with a model with a simplification where you don't need markets. So the absence of markets turned out not to be very important because they assumed a world in which if there were markets, there would be no trading in those markets. That's the model of the representative agent where everybody's the same. And so, in a way, by construction, they created a model where the absence of markets had no consequences. And they began their analysis with that. And one of the implications of that is there are no macroeconomic inconsistencies, no bankruptcies, because if there's no markets, there's no possibility of default. So it was a very weird model. You only have finance if somebody's lending to somebody else. But if everybody's the same, who is the person going to lend to? Now, for those of you who've been following recent advances in economics, there are a set of models called HANK, Heterogeneous Agent New Keynesian models, that have tried to remedy this effect, this defect, but they've done it in a way that's equally or almost as bad, because they assume that somehow when you have this huge heterogeneity, that people could figure out the equilibrium of what the economy would be like if there were a full set of markets. And it turns out it takes the computer a long time to solve that problem. And they mysteriously argue that each of you are smart enough to figure out all of this that takes the computer hours and days to solve. And there is a framework that says, well, you may not have solved it, but you act as if you did. But how you do that as if is a little bit of a mystery. But it's even worse than that, because for the computer to solve that, they have to know everybody's preferences and every firm's technology. But the whole point of a market economy is we don't have that information. And we don't need that information. Central planning had that information, but that never worked. So it's a description of a market economy that doesn't exist. And it's an information requirement that is impossible. So the most important point is that in the act with the incomplete set of markets, it's not possible to check that all plans will be consistent in every state, and it's likely that they will be revealed not to be consistent in some states at some date. We see that all the time in the multiple crises that we have around the world, and not just in developing countries, not just in Argentina, but also like in the United States in 2008. So the bottom line is that the standard equilibrium assumption is misguided. Moreover, the standard model has a kind of cognitive dissonance to it because you assume you're in equilibrium, and then what happens? We discover over and over again that we're not. What we planned didn't happen. We didn't plan on an event like the pandemic. We didn't plan on 2008. We have bankruptcies. We have things that happened that we didn't anticipate. And so we have to revise. But what do? Things that we did not anticipate, we thought we were in equilibrium, we're off equilibrium, and then we assume the next moment we are always going to be in equilibrium, even after we just learned that we were not in equilibrium. So it takes an amazing amount of cognitive dissonance to believe that you're always in equilibrium, even though you're always learning that you're not in equilibrium. I think there's an expression for that. A crazy person who keeps believing is somebody defined as believing the same thing even when it's proven not to be true. So that leads to a whole set of analytic questions of what are the assumptions of the model that lead to it being a poor tool for understanding macroeconomics. I'm going to go through this very quickly because we don't have that much time, and I'd like to have some time for questions. But I mentioned already the assumption of stochastic is the way they model stochastic is not persuasive. The shocks are not described by an independent distribution that's the same, a technology shock. The shocks are exogenous in the standard model rather than endogenous. They're shocks to technology, and if you looked at all the shocks that I described in the beginning of the talk, none of them are technological shocks. We do have technology shocks, and particularly agrarian economies have weather shocks, but most of the shocks that we have are not technology shocks. The assumptions of rational expectations. How can you have rational expectations about the consequence of events that have never occurred? It just doesn't compute. And the interesting thing is, this is just you might say a philosophical aside. Those who do work in decision theory, how do people make decisions? The question of whether you can describe behavior well as if people maximized expected utility with well-defined subjective probabilities is a subject that was being discussed in economics and philosophy and probability theory and statistics for 80 years. And the general consensus is you can't. And there are systematic large deviations from the assumptions that you need for using the expected utility. And what is remarkable is that macroeconomics developed as if that whole literature never existed. They ignored it. The good news is that a lot of work in economics now is in behavioral economics, trying to study how people do behave in the presence of uncertainty, and the evidence is very, very strong that it's not consistent with rational expectations. Well, there are lots of other aspects. They ignore distribution effects, which the Hank models have shown to be first order importance, and a lot of the work that was done well before that in Keynesian models argued that they were of first order importance. they assume that there's perfect mobility across sectors. Sectoral shocks are not important. But, just to get ahead of the story, the experience we're going through with the pandemic has emphasized how important sectoral shocks were. The pandemic hit the service sector much differently than it did the manufacturing sector. Goods don't flow easily from one sector to another. And the standard macro model modeled it as if there was a single aggregate production function where you could move resources smoothly from one sector to another. And of course, they also assumed that institutions and contract forms don't matter, and they do. Again, looking at the COVID-19, one of the big problems that we experienced in COVID-19 is that there was a shortage of supply of chips, the aggregate supply, and to the auto industry. And the result of that is auto prices went way up because production went way down. But the chips were, the production was like it was before COVID-19. What was the problem? They had signed long-run contracts, with large penalties for breaking them. And the government ignored the macroeconomic externality of benefits of shifting production from making smart telephones, iPhones, where you could have lived without getting a new iPhone, but the economy suffered a great deal because it couldn't get cars. And it was one of the major sources in 2021 of inflation with very large ramifications. I don't know how many of you followed what happened, the meltdown in the pension, the almost meltdown in the pension system in the UK 2 weeks ago that led to the government collapsing. Well, that was because the pension funds had signed contracts with some banks that ignored the possibility of an event like central banks raising interest rates and interest rates rising and foreign exchange rates going down. A simple event, but they wrote the wrong contract and it brought down the British government. So it shows you how important these are, and they are typically left out of the macro models. So the first set of assumptions are all related to the equilibrium, my criticism of equilibrium. The second set has to do with when you're out of equilibrium, how does the economy adjust? And the standard model said, mysteriously, it goes back to equilibrium. I criticize that. But in the real world, when you're out of equilibrium, you have a process of decentralized adjustment. If there's a shortage of chips, the price of chips goes up. A shortage of cars, the price of cars go up. They're not solving an equilibrium problem. They're just responding to the way the market is today. Shortage of labor, real wages should go up. And then the question is, if that is the description of how markets work, is that system stable? That's an analytic question, and the answer is very simple, no. And that was one of the Keynes's real insights, that if you have a shortage of jobs, wages fall, and that increases the demand for labor. But he went on to say, but if wages go down, incomes go down, and people have less to spend. And if they spend less, the demand for goods goes down, and if the demand for goods goes down, demand for labor goes down. So you have to assess that substitution effect with the income effect. And in a wide variety of circumstances, the income effect dominates the substitution effect, and lowering wages leads to more unemployment. not less. And there are a whole variety of models that actually show that that is in general the case. And there are many other examples that we can give. The macroeconomic inconsistencies that I talked about that get exhibited when an event you hadn't anticipated occurs may get exacerbated rather than resolved by the decentralized dynamics. One other point I'll just make in this regard, it is the old equilibrating mechanism in that was referred to as Say's law, that it was the idea that supply creates its own demand. If you produce, that creates income. Income needs to be spent, and it's spent in buying the goods that were produced. So this is a very old idea, and if you haven't studied it again, it's fine. You shouldn't feel bad because it's not a very good idea. But it had a certain persuasive aspect to it. But we now understand what was wrong with that reasoning. If that reasoning were right, we would never have unemployment. If supply created its own demand, then we would always be at full employment. But the obvious answer is really simple, that people can put the income into a non-produced good. Land, money, the equity value of corporations. They can spend their money on things other than produced goods. And then supply does not create its own demand for produced goods. And here the critical point is the shocks to the economy that I described over the last few minutes often create more uncertainty, and that uncertainty leads to an increased demand for assets that are viewed as safe. And the non-produced assets are often the best, viewed as the safest assets. So precisely at the time when you have these shocks are times when the problem of supply not creating its own demand gets worse and precautionary demand goes way up. We saw that at least in the United States, in the pandemic. The United States usually has a really low savings rate. 7% went down to 2%, went down to 0%. It's really low. In the midst of COVID-19, the savings rate in the United States went up to 25%. And the savings rate of the upper part of our income distribution went up to more than 40%. It was understandable. They didn't know how long COVID was going to last. They didn't know the economic consequences, and that led to enormous demand for precautionary savings. So the third central problem is the one I've already hinted at, that the nature of the shocks to the economy are very different from those that the standard model assumes. They're endogenous, they're not well described by well-defined probability distributions. In some of our work, we prefer to refer to it as noise rather than stochastic, because it's just a volatility. And we argue that the central problem in understanding large episodic unemployment is understanding the nature and magnitude of the shocks to aggregate demand rather than wage rigidities. And let me say, this is another example. When you construct a model, you have to think very carefully about how the assumptions you put in the model bias the policy. So if you assume the only deviation from the perfect world, nirvana, of the perfect competition model is a nominal wage rigidity, how can you return the world to nirvana, to a world in which everything is efficient and nice? Well, eliminate the wage rigidity. And what does that mean? Lowering workers' wages. So the assumption that nominal wage rigidity is the core problem is an assumption that says, if we can, let's make workers suffer more. Now they're suffering first from unemployment, and now we're going to tell them, cut your wages, weaken unions. And of course, in a world that we live today where the share of workers' labor is going down and working conditions are getting worse, this is a prescription, I think, that is not only wrong, but from a welfare point of view, disastrous. So, as we think about what are some of the key issues, we have to understand how financial frictions and other market rigidities amplify shocks. Heterogeneous beliefs and changes in the degree of dispersion give rise to large fluctuations in aggregate demand. One of the things, one strand of our work is focused on is the rational expectation model assumes everybody believes the same thing. But in fact, the fact that we're having this discussion saying I don't agree with the rational expectations model is evidence that that model has to be wrong, because I'm not agreeing with that model. So it should be clear that we don't agree about a lot of things. And particularly, we don't agree about the effects of inflation. Some people are trying to figure out whether there's persistence, some are not. And that means if there are differences in views in a normal market economy, there's room for a bet. And what we show is those bets can be explicit or can be implicit. They're buried in stock market prices, bond prices. Those implicit bets are throughout our economy. And that gives rise to pseudo-wealth, where people believe that they are wealthier than the economy. To put it another way, if Martin and I have a bet, I think I'm going to win, and he thinks he's going to win. So the total of our wealth is greater than the wealth of the economy. But that amount by which it's greater can fluctuate. And we show it fluctuates in ways that can give rise to economic fluctuations. And then a core point is, because the economy is always evolving, we're always learning, and that itself gives rise to more complicated dynamics. So how much time do I have? What time is it now? Okay, so let me go quickly. And Okay, so I think we want to have some time for discussion. Okay, so I've sort of laid out some of the key ingredients of a dynamic disequilibrium model with randomness and noise. And a key characteristic is that there's always learning. We're always learning about how the economic system is operating. So there's never really an equilibrium. And we're always finding out that the world may be different from what we thought. And those events that are most disturbing are those that most reveal differences between our prior views and reality. So 2008 was very disturbing. because 2008, everybody had thought for almost 20 years what was called the Great Moderation. And we thought we understood how the economy operated. And suddenly the Great Moderation turned out to be the Great Fraud. And we thought there was a swindle. We thought those financial products that were supposed to stabilize the economy destabilized it. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and figure out where was our thinking wrong. And it was deeply wrong. And so those are the points that can be most disturbing, but also most conflictual, because at that point, we had a consensus on the Great Moderation. Most reasonable economists believed in the Great Moderation. And then we had something that was totally inconsistent with that Great Moderation, and that led to a moment of large inconsistency. So what we've done, and I'm going to skip through this, is develop a set of models that can make the response to increased uncertainty more precise. We can formalize that. The key thing is that when an event like the Great Recession occurs, it increases uncertainty, because we thought we understood the world, and then we know that we didn't understand the world. And that means the dispersion in our own beliefs and societal beliefs increased. So I'm not going to have time to go through how this plays out, but it operates not only through the economic system, but also through the social political system. And learning plays a very pivotal effect. One important thing I'll just spend a minute on is that people in central banks, IMF, have a very difficult job, because they have to make forecasts. And one of the problems is that these are large institutions in general, and they have models. And when you have a shock, they have a hard time adapting their models to the rapid change in the evidence about the world. And so what do? Well, in practice, they do exactly what I said before. It reflects the cognitive dissonance. They think the world hasn't changed, but they were just off the last month. And so they say, the world is just like I thought it was, but I just was wrong last month. And so what do? They adjust for that last month, and then they make the same kind of forecast. And then what happens? Because the world is really different than they thought, they're again wrong. But what do? They are enormously resistant to learning, even though they're well trained. So again, they make a mistake, and this goes on over and over again. So we have a couple of charts from the Federal Reserve. I'm sure you do a better job here in Chile, but this shows how they keep the picture period after period after period. They keep having the same kind of curve and keep adjusting for the fact that, oh yes, we were wrong last month, but it's going to grow just like we predicted. And I think it really shows an enormous resilience of the Federal Reserve in not learning. And you have to give them credit. This is another example at the IMF. So it's not just one institution. This is a general, and hopefully when you go to these institutions, you'll do a better job than these did in learning that the world is different from what you thought it was when you have an event like the Great Recession, which is markedly different from what you thought. So belief formation, what's very difficult, these are very nonlinear, these are very complicated, these are fundamental changes in the structure of different from what we thought, and so we shouldn't be surprised that it's difficult. And we, part of the research has been to show exactly how bad learning processes can be with linear models, linear prediction models, when the underlying structure is very nonlinear. And in fact, the world is very, very nonlinear. So now I would just spend a few minutes on a question of policy guidance. One of the critical questions in policy guidance is how to restore quickly the economy to full employment when these macroeconomic inconsistencies get revealed. And what I want to emphasize here is that there are many instruments, standard instruments that economists, monetary, fiscal policy, but the framework that we talk of, our framework, highlights some additional instruments. Monetary policy is important, fiscal policy is important, even more important than I think has been traditionally realized. But one aspect of it is better debt restructuring mechanisms. That one of the problems in macroeconomic inconsistency is people have taken debts that are well beyond what they can pay, believing that they were going to be able to pay them. And this is really important. Right now, we're anticipating a major set of sovereign debt problems in the third world. And we don't have a good mechanism for debt restructuring. And if we did, it would restore the global economy much faster. There are other things like I've already mentioned, automatic stabilizers, limiting exposure to endogenous and exogenous shocks, including restricting destabilizing speculation, financial sector regulation, restrictions on capital flows, greater emphasis on fiscal policy, which can be timely, more effective, less distortionary than monetary policy. But another important part reflects the fundamental problem that I talked about before, which is the absence of risk markets. And so better public risk-sharing mechanisms of a whole variety of forms can be effective. And one example are income contingent loans of the kind that they have in Australia for education. Another form are a whole set of sectoral policies. I think I'm going to skip through this. An interesting thing is that the world is now going through a big debate about inflation. We haven't had inflation like this for 50 years. The world today is very different from the world 50 years ago. In the United States, unions were stronger, there wasn't globalization, we had different legal frameworks for labor relations, a whole set of things. We were more of a manufacturing economy, less of a service sector economy, not a knowledge-based economy. And therefore, it's very hard to make inferences with confidence about today based on what happened 50 years ago. Do we really believe that we can just look at the data 50 years ago for making a strong prediction of what's going on today? And 50 years ago, we had an oil price shock. We didn't have a COVID-19 shock and an oil price shock. So all of this illustrates the fact that we are in a disequilibrium today. Making inferences is much more difficult. than would be the case using an equilibrium model. And the real point I want to emphasize is the dangers of using an equilibrium model when you are in these very nuanced situations where there are heterogeneous belief formation, and we have to really understand those heterogeneous, and it leads to a very different policy response to the inflation than we otherwise have. So the bottom line is that this theory of disequilibrium, I think, returns macroeconomics to better and more relevant foundations. While we can't know everything, and we know we don't know, that's better than thinking that you know things that you don't know. So we know that we don't know, but there are certain common things that we do know. That we know in an economic downturn, fiscal policy can be very effective. We know that automatic stabilizers can be very effective. So what I want to emphasize is we know less than we pretend to know with the equilibrium model, but it doesn't leave us rudderless. We do know a lot, and by focusing on what we do know on the basis of disequilibrium models, I believe we can do a better job in policy than pretending that we know more than we really do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. After 4, he will keep talking to students, so there is a lot of Joe today, but since we'll be soon over for the students' event, I prefer to talk in English so we can discuss a little bit. I want to provoke you,
okay,
and to make this a little bit more fun, okay? And I will say it in English because then we don't complain that it was the translation the problem. So I enjoy your idea. We have to think more. Perhaps we have reached too much on the stochastic general equilibrium models, and we go to Hanks and try to study heterogeneous agents, but we know that it's limited what we can do. So perhaps we have to look, going from this idea of equilibrium from physics, moving to evolution, more biology is quite, I think, that interesting, thoughtful. However, the job has not been done. We have to learn a lot more about that. So, but I want to defend equilibrium and what I learned from you. Because equilibrium doesn't mean that it's optimal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have public policy. In Stiglitz device, we learned that there could be inefficient credit rationing. So there are roles for public policy. In the Stiglitz model, that today is the basis of central banking models, we learn in those models that there could be an equilibrium with monopolistic firms, inefficiencies, and on top of that, new Keynesian models are not of fixed wages, are of fixed prices. So, and then we can do it, but still it's too streamlined. If you go to a central bank and you watch the models, sometimes you're a little bit ashamed because it's too simple. It's kind of sometimes silly assumptions. But what is equilibrium? Equilibrium is, this is the way that as I learned it, equilibrium is consumers are doing their best. They are on their demand. Producers are doing their best. They are on their supply. And markets equilibrate. So there is no, it could be, there is a lot of imperfect competition. We have to make assumptions about expectations. We have to make assumptions about dynamic shocks, many things. So there is nothing, I would say, normative about saying that this is optimal. So I think that this is important as a way as I see it, because I would never say that we live in an arrow the very perfect with all the welfare theorems applying. And then it comes to the second thing that you say, which is we will never predict crisis. Now, this is a problem that we cannot solve. Because if we were able to predict crisis, there wouldn't be crisis. So The empirical issue is how many crises we have avoided. Because there are crises, but some crises may have been, we don't know. It's a very interesting issue, but just to think over a wine, okay? But let me make a point. I think that there is an issue about predicting, and there is an issue about addressing a crisis. And I think that we have learned a lot. The Great Depression and the global financial crisis were similar in initial wealth effect. But the global financial crisis was one order of magnitude less dramatic because we have learned. We have learned that we need a lender of last resort. We know that we had to intervene financial markets and many things and do expansionary monetary policy. So we learn a lot, and we can. The COVID crisis, I always said, with 5 months of lockdown, the world produced just 3% less than the previous year. And this was because there was also a strong policy reaction. And what was a strong policy reaction? Credit. There was a lot of credit. All governments and central banks provided credit guarantees because it was the only way to provide credit for a crisis that was basically a debt crisis because people had to pay debt during 6 months but don't work. So that was the demand. So we have learned, and so I think that we have to learn much more and not be complacent, but we have learned. And let me go to emerging markets. We have had the global financial crisis, and we did much better than advanced economies. Never in history, after a crisis, a global crisis, emerging markets can do better than the advanced economies. The norm was when usually the idea was that when there is a sneeze in advanced economies, there is a tough, sickness in emerging markets. Now it was completely the contrary. Even in some parts in the previous year, there was this great moderation. With the great moderation, the argument is that we know a lot about policies, but we don't know a lot about shocks. So this is why the great moderation won't last forever. But I think that's very important to recognize that all emerging markets, most emerging markets, there are also exceptions, countries that has a long-term problem, some emerging markets, okay, in the region, in Asia, but most emerging markets did quite well. And I think that this is something that we learned from the mistakes in the Asian crisis. Because in the Asian crisis, we were used to combat global problems, tightening fiscal and monetary policy, which is going exactly the other way around, and not letting exchange rate to adjust. We didn't do that in 10 years later or 12 years later, and we did much better with a much deeper crisis. So I want to put the optimistic side. I don't want to. So I'm looking at the other side that you haven't discussed. And finally, just a minor point. You are right that central banks use models without banks. It's kind of awkward. But they should be called monetary authorities because their models have money. So, okay.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Let me make just a couple. I agree, we've learned a lot, and we do a lot better. And I think your point is that, actually there's a lot of empirical evidence that economies are more stable, have been managed a lot better in the last 80 years than they were in the previous 120 years of capitalism. So we've done, I think, a lot better, and I think we've learned a lot. But it's also the case that the models that I've criticized have actually, in some instances, moved us in the wrong direction. And that's some of the things that we want to unlearn what we learned wrongly. So let me give you a couple of examples. And without being personal, I'll mention a couple of names. In the I know. In the years before the 2008 crisis, the central banks, Federal Reserve in particular, used models where they believed that risk was disseminated throughout the economy, and that markets were rational, and they said, therefore, financial deregulation increased efficiency and ignored the effects of the financial innovations in enhancing instability. And they said that that enables us to move towards deregulation. And it was interesting, Greenspan, in the testimony that he had to give to Congress after the financial crisis, said this was the big flaw in his reasoning. And there was a whole movie called The Flaw. And the point is that he took the models too seriously and didn't learn from the long history of financial crises. And that led to a set of policies that led the economy to be more unstable. Then a little bit later, Ben Bernanke, after the housing bubble broke, a bubble which the models they used said could not have occurred because you don't have bubbles in rational models, he said, don't worry, the risks are contained because we've diversified our economy. Well, a few months later, we had a financial crisis. Now, I think we are making progress, and so I want to also be on an optimistic note. The models that they used did not have the interrelations among the banks. They didn't even study them. I had written a book with Bruce Greenwald talking about how when you have a network of banks, the collapse of one bank could lead to a bankruptcy cascade. And one of the problems of the standard model was because they didn't have banks, they didn't have bankruptcy cascades. And that had major effects. One of the central banks was worried, the Bank of England. And they had one economist there, Andy Haldane, who did a fantastic job of articulating these worries, but it didn't have any effect on most central banks around the world, including the Bank of England. But he was director of research and still had a limited effect. So I think we've learned and we are continuing to learn. I want to make one more comment on equilibrium. When we're talking about equilibrium, the standard model focuses on intertemporal, how you make decisions over a very infinite lifetime. But what we've emphasized on disequilibrium says what's really important is uncertainty and how you respond. Now, optimally, you need to think about over time and in uncertainty. But models are complicated, so you have to make simplifications. And so the point that I think I want to emphasize is, it turns out in moments of crisis, uncertainty is far more important than the Euler equations, which are the equations that describe intertemporal allocation. Martin, do you want to?
And you know what I'm going to say, so I'm going to speak in Spanish. And
okay.
Can you hear me? ¿Ya? ¿Me escuchan bien? Bueno, primero quiero agradecer por la invitación y agradecerle a las autoridades de la universidad, presidenta de la facultad, José, y a todos ustedes. Es un honor estar aquí en la Universidad de Chile junto al profesor Stiglitz. Yendo a las preguntas que plantea José, algunos comentarios complementarios de la respuesta de Joe. ¿Cuál es la intención que tenemos detrás de esta construcción teórica? Bueno, uno lo que intenta siempre es entender mejor cómo funciona el sistema económico o los sistemas económicos en general, y que eso también nos ayude a tener una mejor guía para hacer política económica. Y para eso nos ayudamos de modelos. Todo modelo se basa en un conjunto de axiomas y hay un rango de relevancia de ese conjunto de axiomas. José explicaba que equilibrio no necesariamente significa eficiencia, efectivamente. Bueno, el profesor Stiglitz en la década de los 70, en los 80, en los 90 ha desarrollado toda una literatura en la cual se toma el modelo básico, estándar Arrow de Bremer, mercados completos, y se va cambiando un poquitito cada uno de los supuestos. Por ejemplo, en vez de información perfecta, permitimos que haya información imperfecta, etcétera. Y lo que vemos es que efectivamente tenemos situaciones en donde hay equilibrio de mercado sin que la solución de mercado sea eficiente, y eso da lugar a la intervención, a que sea óptimo que haya cierta intervención de parte de la política económica. En esta estructura teórica nos enfocamos en un aspecto en particular, nos centramos en un aspecto, que es el tema del conocimiento que tienen los participantes de la economía sobre los distintos estados, las distintas cosas que pueden pasar en la economía. El mundo de mercados completos asume que todos tenemos conocimiento completo del espacio de estados que se pueden dar en la economía. Uno puede pensar que hay distintas probabilidades para las cosas, pero todas las cosas que pueden ocurrir en el mundo, todas podemos definirlas. Y lo que nosotros encontramos es que eso pone una gran limitación al entendimiento de las dinámicas de las economías. Hay cosas que son imposibles de anticipar. ¿Quién hubiera podido anticipar, por ejemplo, una pandemia seguida de una guerra como tuvimos en los últimos 3 años? Y lo que esto implica es que cuando tomamos decisiones económicas, es imposible que podamos saber que en cada una de las contingencias que se pueden presentar se van a cumplir lo que llamamos las condiciones de transversalidad. Entonces, ¿qué pasa? Va a haber situaciones en las cuales el sistema económico va a estar en un estado de inconsistencia. Hay un conjunto de promesas, contratos, relaciones de crédito, deuda, que van a resultar inconsistentes con la suma de recursos que hay en la economía. ¿Sí? Las cuentas no cierran. ¿Y qué pasa cuando esa situación de inconsistencias macroeconómicas se presentan? Para nosotros ese es un objeto de estudio muy importante, porque eso tiene consecuencias para la dinámica de la economía. Y el esquema tradicional, este es un fenómeno que no aborda. Por supuesto que esto es complementario de todas otras construcciones teóricas en donde las condiciones de transversalidad siempre se cumplen. Las implicancias de política son de gran relevancia. Por ejemplo, en un mundo como en el mundo de Arrow de Bremer, en el mundo de mercados completos, no existen los problemas de sostenibilidad de las deudas. No pasa nada, porque pudimos definir para cada contingencia cuál es la relación entre el deudor y el acreedor que se puede cumplir. Bueno, ¿qué pasa si no estamos ahí? ¿Cómo resolvemos un problema de inconsistencia macroeconómica? Y ahí yo explicaba la importancia de contar con mecanismos para ello. Este esquema también nos permite preguntarnos más profundamente sobre las cuestiones de coordinación en una economía de mercado. Cómo los agentes económicos, cómo toda la sociedad termina coordinándose y qué características tienen las soluciones de una economía de mercado. Una discusión muy interesante que tuvimos en estos días, entre ayer y hoy, aquí en Santiago, con varias de las personas con las que tuvimos muy valiosas reuniones, era el tema de la inflación. Y esto de la coordinación surgía todo el tiempo. Escuchábamos que, y bueno, yo desde Argentina, nosotros lo sabemos muy bien, la inflación en Argentina ha sido históricamente el principal problema de la economía. Hay un foco puesto en evitar que el proceso se vuelva persistente, que la formación de precios empiece a incluir un componente de expectativas que le dé persistencia al fenómeno de la inflación. Ahora, si nosotros decimos que estamos en un mundo en donde no podemos conocer todos los estados que se pueden dar, bueno, directamente entonces es imposible que haya expectativas racionales, porque hay eventos que ni siquiera podemos definir. Y estamos abriendo la puerta a un mundo donde es muy probable que las expectativas sean diferentes. Tal vez los sindicatos tengan unas expectativas, el Banco Central tenga otras expectativas, otros participantes de mercados tengan otras expectativas, cómo se coordinan todas esas expectativas y cuáles son las características dinámicas que tiene la economía en un contexto tal. Estas nosotros encontramos que son preguntas que en el marco tradicional para el análisis macroeconómico son muy difíciles o prácticamente imposibles de responder. Y marcos más flexibles sobre ciertas hipótesis nos permiten adentrarnos en buscar respuestas a preguntas que son ciertamente complejas.
Muchas gracias, Martín. Muy interesante, estamos en la hora. Ahora viene una cosa con los estudiantes, va a seguir Joe aquí, algunos nos tenemos que ir, pero generosamente con Martín nos van a dedicar más tiempo. Yo antes de terminar, eso sí, quería llamar al escenario a Juan Pablo Castro y Joaquín Martínez, miembros de la mesa organizadora de esta segunda versión del Congreso Crítico de Ciencia Económica y Administrativa, quienes quieren entregar un reconocimiento al profesor Stiglitz. Ahora los estudiantes,
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
Good question. Yeah, we couldn't pull the answer, but it's the Euler equation versus the uncertainty.
No, that's it. En Nueva York no vemos.
So, Joe, the presentation is just here.
What?
The presentation is here.
I think what I am thinking that maybe you'd like to give it a project and ask the question. So the